Welcome to the Cafe Culture Podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy, and science.
Good evening. Thanks for coming, and welcome to tonight's Café Scientifique. So, I'll give a brief introduction to the topic today, which is about sustainable seas and the importance of coral reef survival. We have two speakers, as I said. Our first speaker is Selina Stead from Newcastle University. Selina is a professor of marine governance and environmental science. She is the UK government's chief scientific advisor for the Marine Management Organization and has many other roles as well, but I thought that one was particularly impressive. Selina is a trained marine biologist. She has postgraduate degrees in fisheries biology and management and zoology, and which is quite nice for this topic, she is a keen snorkeler and diver. And Selina will be our first speaker, and once Selina has finished her talk, I'll quickly introduce our second one. Okay, thanks, Selina.
Good evening. Thank you for coming along. Nice to see you all here tonight. And I thought I couldn't really start without first asking, who has been watching Blue Planet 2? How many of you that are not marine biologists would like to be a marine biologist? Because if there's any of you, excellent. So I'll hang around at the end if you'd like to know about what we can offer at Newcastle University. I'll be very happy. If I get that out quickly, I can get to what we're talking about. So the topic we've been asked to talk about is coral reefs and sustainable seas. It's a topic I feel very passionate about. And when we think that over 70% of our planet is the oceans, then it's the statistic that's often missed is that although coral reefs take up less than 0.1%, actually 25% of all fish biodiversity is in coral reefs. And how do we describe them? To me, they're like the mega cities, the underwater cities. And I always say that if you imagine the most vivid rainbow, put that against a turquoise canvas, make it into a kaleidoscope, and I still don't think you can ever come close to coral reefs. They really are a marine biologist and anybody's dream. So we're doing a two-part talk tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit, a slightly different dimension about why they're really important to small islands and to people. And then my colleague, James, he's going to tell you more about the biology and the wonderful life of corals. So we thought we'd split into, give you two little dimensions. And then what I wanted to get your help with is a central question that I'm working on in my work. And my work is about how can the UK help other small islands balance and protecting not just the seas, but also very much the people that depend on coral reefs and the seas as part of their livelihoods. And the reason that I became very interested in the people side is that as a fisheries biologist, I was learning that the way that you manage the sea was very much about, okay, how many fish, what is the population, how many can we catch, doing lots of modelling, lots of statistics. And then it eventually occurred to me, I thought, well, okay, that's all very well having all these statistics, all these models, but you can't really manage models. It's about managing people. And the reason I say that is because if we understand people's perceptions, we then understand their attitudes and we understand their behaviour. And so I became very interested in why do people follow rules? Why do people break rules? Especially because there's so much interest in marine protected areas. Maybe it's because I'm an academic, maybe because we like testing the rules, the systems. But it's a really important part of my work, and that's why I wanted to share with you some research that I've been doing in small tropical islands. And before I tell you a little bit about that, if you didn't know, the UK has just pledged £20 million in order to do research on what's called the Blue Belt. And this is for the overseas territories. And it's very much about how can we protect, how can we help some of our overseas territories around the world? What lessons can we share from the UK? You might sort of think, well, hold on a minute, what can the UK share with all these tropical islands? Well, you may not know, but a lot of the management in these tropical islands is built on British legislation. It's built on our planning. And interestingly, in the UK, a lot of the lessons we've learned about how to manage our seas, particularly what they call marine protected areas, parts of the sea that you can get access to use or excluded from using, a lot of that has come from tropical islands. So we've always had this relationship with what happens overseas and what happens here. So why are coral reefs really important to the small islands, and why are they really important to people? So I thought I'd share with you about the Seychelles. The reason I'm going to talk about the Seychelles was this is the first country that I worked in when I came to Newcastle University. I was based up in Aberdeen for about 12 years. I think I needed to defrost. And then I learned that Newcastle was home to some of the world's best coral reef researchers. And I'd always had a passion for coral reefs and always wanted to come and work on them. So I was very fortunate when I was appointed as a lecturer in tropical coastal management to be able to, the first place I was asked, and you can imagine how long it took me to answer the question when they said, would you like to help with some research in the Seychelles? I was there like a flash. But the Seychelles, I think people often think of these small islands as they are tropical paradise. Somewhere like the Seychelles has a reputation for the jet set, but there are people there that don't have access to electricity, don't have access to good sanitary conditions. There is quite a different picture. I also work in East Africa. I work on complete extremes of where people are really reliant on the coral reefs for different reasons. But let's stick with the Seychelles. And like many small islands, the Seychelles is really dependent on coral reefs for its fisheries, but also for its tourism. Why I chose the Seychelles is that because I started there in 2005 and I was asked to go back there a couple of years ago, and I'll tell you that story briefly, is that in 1998, because of the increase in sea temperature, the Seychelles lost over 90% of damage to its coral reefs. That's a huge, it's really hard to imagine that amount of damage that can happen. We've brought some props along and for you to come and have a look at, but if you see the really bright white corals, that is when they have died. I'm sure James or we can talk afterwards about how that happens, but there has been other incidents. So there was the biggest bleaching event in 1998. There was another bleaching event in 2004, and then similarly last year. And when I mentioned at the beginning about the most fish being related to coral reefs, in the Seychelles, they rely on coral reefs for two main purposes: for the fisheries, for jobs, and for income. And you've got a lot of small local fishermen that rely on the reefs. And then also for tourism, people go for diving, for snorkeling, for sport fishing. And it's a really, really big, important draw. So you can appreciate that with the damaged reefs, that has huge impacts on the amount of fish provided for food, the amount of fish for tourism, and also for people to go and enjoy. Now, the Seychelles, what also happened is that I give it an example as a black swan event, a term I discovered more recently, something that you can't even possibly predict. And what happened in the Seychelles was that when there was the economic downturn in the mid-2000s, that really affected tourism. So where it relied on tourists, especially from America, the UK, other parts of the world, it really impacted them. And so they decided to float their currency, and they've always been very big on marine protection. And then when the bleaching event happened, that was starting to impact the number of fish. They rely very heavy on imports, sometimes up to 70% of especially fresh vegetables and fruit, which is important for supplying the tourism industry. And then when they thought nothing else could possibly go wrong, the ash cloud happened. When that ash cloud happened, that really impacted the tourists from going. It also really impacted the imports. So they decided, And this is why I was asked to go back a couple of years ago. Right, okay, we cannot produce enough seafood. If you don't know the Seychelles, it's 115 small islands. Most of the populations live on 3 main islands. It's a population around about 92,000 people. But it has mass influences of tourism, and it's also had a lot of workers coming in from different countries to help with the construction. But they've decided, should they or should they not consider mariculture? Should they consider farming? And especially, is that growing of coral reefs? Would that help conservation? Could this be growing different fish? Or another area that I work on is sea cucumbers. Sea cucumbers, you might think, why would they want to grow sea cucumbers? These live seagrasses near coral reefs, but you can get just under $2,000 per kilo for a sea cucumber. So these small islands that can be quite isolated, they need to focus on high-end niche value products so that they can get the export revenue. But the dilemma about aquaculture, and people have strong views for or against, depending on how familiar you are with it, that the problem about aquaculture is what type of aquaculture do you do? And if you think that people think of the Seychelles, they go for that teal, turquoise sea, the sun-kissed white beaches. Do they want to see a fish cage? Could that have an impact on the tourism? Similarly with the reefs, and I'll leave that to James, that's his area of expertise. But, do they want to see some of the electric reefs? How do you sustain the coral reefs? How do you keep that balanced view? So I was asked to go and look at their review. Should they or shouldn't they do aquaculture of the coral reefs? And if they should, what kind of animals should they grow? What's best for local people? What would be best for export? And then there was something else that was happening in La Réunion, which is not too far away from the Seychelles. There started to be a lot of shark attacks, and part of this was attributed to the introduction of aquaculture. So there's a lot of controversy at the moment about, well, can aquaculture help the coral reefs? And if it can, what are the risks to that? So that's part of the work we've been looking at. And then this question that comes back to, well, how do you balance protection of the coral reefs with protection of people's livelihoods? Who has the right? Especially when it comes to fishing, and how can you ensure that people can still take enough fish without completely doing damage to the reefs? So it's this question that, as a marine biologist, of course, fascinated by the health. How do we keep healthy coral reefs? And so what we've been trying to say is that a lot of studies, when they, as zoologists, marine biologists, we tend to just look at one species or one habitat. And what we're saying is that the coral reefs are so complex, you've got to look at the different type of corals, the different types of plants, the different type of animals, right from the shells all the way up to the sharks. And how do you do that? Because if you don't do that, and then if you don't start to look at the oceanography, you don't understand the currents, how is that changing? And the reason we're particularly I think it's important to do about climate change, no matter what your views are about climate change, what is very certain is that it's the rate of change. Even in the little experience I've had in just over a decade of being there, it's the how quickly the winds, the severity of the storms are changing, and that brings lots of health and safety and concerns for the fishermen that are going out on the coral reefs to do their fishing. Not only is it the rate, it's how extreme. So the changes in temperature as well are much quicker, much greater than before. So this is why it's really important. We're trying to build up this picture. So in the last few minutes, because I can get really carried away if I start talking about all the different possibilities, it's quite a provocative question in the sense that how do you balance protecting the seas with those people that, especially people that don't have many alternatives for food and jobs? Do we have a right to say you don't have access to that sea because we think it's more important to protect, but they don't have other options? Some of the countries I work in Tanzania and Kenya, don't always have those other options. And I'll just finish on a couple of last little points that I mentioned in the beginning. A lot of marine management traditionally has been very much based on environmental data. And part of what we're trying to do is get that balance between understanding the health of the different corals, the different animals, the different plants, how that all interacts, but equally understanding the interactions of people, because if we can motivate people's behaviour so that they make positive impacts, then the ideal is to always have a win-win situation. And that's very much about my work. So I've gone full circle. As a marine biologist, fascinated by the sea, love coral reef ecosystems, but equally it's about the people that depend on those coral reef ecosystems. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a picture of what I've been involved in. And I'm going to hand over now to James, who's going to tell you all about the coral biology and the life of corals. So thank you very much.